This is the repair of the cruise control on my 97 Dodge Ram diesel pickup. And this is the servo mechanism for the cruise control. Basically, you got a cable that goes over to the throttle assembly linkage. And on the back of this, there's a port right here. This is your vacuum supply line. Attaches to this, and then this electrical plug attaches right here. Now this is actually located underneath this battery box, the driver's side battery box, battery tray. So the easiest way to get this out is this plate actually has 3 screws that mount it to a side wall underneath there. And what I found was that if you remove this hose, coolant hose, top radiator hose, which you'll lose a little bit of coolant but not much, and then with this hose moved out of the way, you can actually lift this windshield washer reservoir out of the way enough so that you can get enough clearance to get your hand down in there with a socket and a long extension and get those 3 screws out. Here they are, these 3 screws to remove this unit. Now I picked up another one at the junkyard right here. Unfortunately, they didn't have any diesel ones in the junkyard. It was gas. This came out of a gas one, and the cable's too long because the cable on the gas one goes up over the top of the motor to the carburetor. And then the other problem is that the plug has 4 pins that are 4 round pins, and on this one there are 4 pins, but they're flat pins. But I'm going to show you how you can take this apart and repair this unit, and I might end up using some of the parts from this one because this one only had about 80,000 miles on it. So the first step is to remove these 2 3/16 inch screws, which I've got a 3/16 inch nut driver for doing that, and then that'll allow you to slide this plastic cover off. The pins will actually stay behind. Now that exposes this little assembly in here, which this little tiny PC board and this metal bracket that you can see right in here, this actually will all slide out as one assembly. Now there's some O-rings in there that actually seat, so they're going to be a little stuck. So you've got to pull up straight up on this and out and gently apply pulling force so you don't damage this unit. Okay, I moved into the stairwell here in the shade because it's getting pretty hot, but this is the junkyard one that I took out of the gas engine, which won't fit. And what I did was I removed these 2 10mm nuts on these 2 studs here. That allows you to slide this boot back, and it exposes this little clip. And if you pull this clip, you can actually disconnect this cable from this unit, and then you can also take this unit right off of the bracket. Now the reason why you might want to do that is that once you remove that coil pack with the plungers and the cable off of this, this is identical on both units. So this is the newer unit. This one only had the 80,000 miles on it or so. So if I wanted to use the diaphragm assembly in here on the new on my truck, then I could fix my coil pack, put it in here, and then actually put it all back together and then attach my cable to here. But I'm going to take it out and check it first. Here are the 2 units that contain the diaphragm removed, and you can see they're identical. This is my original one, and then this is the junkyard one. And here are the 2, I'll call them coil packs. They basically contain 3 solenoids that activate the plungers. Here's the original one, the 4 flat pins, and here's the junkyard one. So I can easily just interchange these 2 and put my coil pack into this newer diaphragm. But before I do that, I'm going to disassemble this and clean this and test it. Now there are several different ways that these cruise control units could fail. One way is that the diaphragm assembly, which I had just shown you, could develop a leak. The rubber can get dry rotted, or it can develop a small pinhole and leak air and not be able to maintain vacuum and actuate the actual throttle cable. The other thing that can go wrong is something can go wrong with this coil pack unit. Now, there are a couple of things that can go wrong with this. First, you can have a problem where the plungers stick and don't actuate properly, which I'm going to show you how those come apart shortly. And I'll show you the little plungers inside. Oftentimes you'll take them out and they'll be rusty, and they'll need to be cleaned up really well and polished. And you can even put a couple of drops of lubricant on there to help free them up. But in this particular case, what's wrong with my pack, which is this one right here, is one of the three coils, which is on the three solenoids, has opened. Now, the way you can test this is you need a meter, and you want to put your meter on the scale for resistance. You want to measure how many ohms each coil has. Now, you can measure that. You can actually see where the connections to each coil are right on this little tiny PC board, and you can put the meter right across the 2 points right there. But another way you can measure is you can also measure by the pins, and this does two things. If you have an open connection between the common pin and one of the coil pins at this location, but then you actually go to the actual coil itself and you test the coil and it's good, then it means you've got a break in the connection between the coil and the pin on the PC board, which might be just a matter of scraping off some of the epoxy here and resoldering an area. But that's really rare because it's such a large pad here on the PC board. It's pretty strong, and it almost never is going to be a problem. So what I've determined is, by looking at it with the coil pack facing in the way that I've got it right here, with this side of the coil pack facing up as opposed to the bracket side, the 1, 2, 3rd pin over is your common pin. And what I mean by common is that it's common to all three coils. One side of all three of these coils is connected to that pin. So I'm going to keep my meter probe, one of my meter probes, on pin number 3 all the time. And then I'm going to move my meter probe from pin 1 to pin 2 to pin 4. And I should get a resistance reading on all three of about the same. And I've already done it, and it's about 42 or 45 ohms. But on one of them, I get a very high resistance reading, which would be indicative of a faulty coil. So if I go from here to here, and then I make the connection, you'll see I'm getting a reading of 44.9 ohms. And then I'm getting that on all of them, except for when I go between pins 3 and 4, I'm getting 0.6 some odd megohms, which essentially is an open coil. That's like 600,000 ohms. It's way too high. Now, here's the one I got out of the junkyard. And on this one, when I measure between pin 3 and pin 1, I get about the same resistance reading, the 40 some odd ohms. I can't really do this with the with one hand holding the camera, but essentially what I'm getting on this one is I'm getting a normal reading. Between 1 and 3, 45 ohms, between 2 and 3, 45 ohms, and between 3 and 4, 45 ohms. So that tells me that all three of these coils are good, as opposed to the one bad one I have in my coil pack. So what I want to do now is I want to determine which one of these three coils corresponds to this fourth pin. Chances are it's going to be this coil here, and oftentimes you can just look at by tracing it. Problem is with this plastic piece and the way it's kind of hard to see. So I'm going to verify that with my ohm meter. I'm going to put one lead on pin 4, and then the other lead I'm going to put on each side of this coil. And if I get a 0 resistance reading or no resistance, then I know that this pin is attached to one side of this coil. And I have determined that this is the faulty coil. So now I want to remove this coil. So the first thing I need to do, I'll put this one aside. First thing I need to do is I need to take this bracket off. This bracket actually just slides on down across the 3 coils. So you can actually, while holding this down firmly, you can actually slide this up and off. Now it may be pretty stuck on there, so you can stick a screwdriver in and pry, but you got to be careful. You don't want to just stick a screwdriver in here and pry right here, because you're going to be putting pressure on the actual windings here, and you could actually damage the windings. So what you can do is you can actually, that's a little bit of grease I got on there. You can actually sneak the screwdriver blade in between this plastic part right here and gently pry up on it. When you remove that bracket, that's going to free up these 2 little plungers right here. So they're going to just drop right out. Now if those plungers don't drop right out, they may be stuck in there from rust or oxidation. And if that's the case, you're going to have to pop those out. And like I said, you're going to have to polish them up really good and clean them before you put them back in. Now interesting to note, this one is the one that came out of this side. This is the one, this one right here, probably can't see it with this lousy video, but the end of this actually looks kind of burnt. And looking down inside the coil, that one looks really nice and clean. That one there also looks like it's got something else going on inside there. And that happens to be the one that's open, so I'm not surprised. Now this little plunger is the part that tends to get corroded and stuck, but this one's actually in pretty good shape. But again, the end of it does look like it's almost burnt. And the way you get those out is this little rubber cap comes right off. It actually just pops off, and when you pop that cap off, there's a little tiny spring. You got to make sure you don't lose the spring. Once you pop that cap off, you just turn it, and the plunger again should slide out freely. If it doesn't, you have to put a little pin in the end there and knock the plunger out, and then you're going to have to clean that up really good and clean up the inside there and try lubricating it. But if they're really badly pitted, you're going to want to replace the whole assembly, which you can't get, so you're back to replacing the whole thing unless you go to a junkyard and get a junkyard pack and steal parts out of a newer one. So here's a side-by-side comparison. This plunger and plug came out of this good coil. This plunger, which has the oxidation or burning on one end, and plug that has the same on one end, came out of the bad coil. This center one, we're not going to disassemble. The reason why is because in order to get that plunger out, you actually have to remove this coil from the PC board, which involves unsoldering it. And since that coil's testing good, I'm not going to bother taking it apart. This coil also rarely has the problem of getting a dirt, grime, or oxidation or rust problems with it, because it's actually got an O-ring on the back, which I don't know why they didn't do that with all of them, but that one's actually pretty well protected. Now I need to unsolder these 2 connections right here so I can take this coil out. And then I'm going to do the same thing on my good used pack, and I'm going to rob this coil and put it in the place of the bad one. Alright, wasn't going to bore you with all of my soldering techniques. All my soldering equipment's up in my office, and I'm not ready for anybody in the YouTube community to see my office. Anyways, so here's the coil that I removed that measures open from my original unit. I look really closely at it. I can actually see, almost looks like a discolored wire right there that looks like it may have overheated. That might be right where the break is. Doesn't matter, it's junk. Here's the junkyard unit with the coil removed, the good coil removed. Basically, if you are not familiar with soldering techniques, this is going to be kind of a tough job. If you are familiar with soldering techniques, it's pretty easy. Took me about 10 minutes to desolder this and take the good coil and solder it back in on my original Dodge assembly here. So now I'm going to put my plungers and plugs back in, and I'm going to use the nicest, cleanest looking ones. So I'm not going to use these discolored ones that came out of that bad coil. I'm going to use a couple of the nice, shiny, almost new looking ones that came out of my junkyard coil pack. Now before I put the metal bracket back on, you need to put the little plungers in the little plugs here in the back side. But first, the plungers go in. Now if you put the plungers in, and then you put the plug in, and you put the bracket on, when you go to push these little rubber tips back on with the springs, there's one with the spring, back onto there, it's kind of hard to get them to clip on to the little plunger. But if you keep it apart, and you take a small screwdriver and stick it in the back so that you can force this plunger all the way out and keep it out as you push the rubber tip on, it will clip on. Now I just completed one last final check with the ohm meter, and between pins 3 and pins 4 I now have about 45 ohms, which is normal. And between 3 and 2 and 3 and 1, of course those were the two good coils, those also about 45 ohms. I've got all my little plungers back on, and now I'm ready to reinstall this unit, and I'm going to reinstall this unit into the newer diaphragm assembly. Okay, now my little coil pack's going to go back in. It can only go one way because these little protrusions on the ends of the brackets actually ride in a couple of slots molded into the side of the plastic case here. So this is actually going to slide in this way. And then you gently push it down to seat it. Those O-rings will pop in. Now I just need to reattach the plastic cover that covers this part right here. And then I'm going to reattach the throttle cable here and install the unit. Okay, this can be a bear, reattaching this end of the cable to the diaphragm assembly. You have to have this bracket on first, because after you attach the cable, this slides over the studs and sandwiches that bracket in between there and bolts it all together. So a couple of tips. You'll notice that I've got this thing, I've got quite a bit of slack in there so that I can pull this apart, and I lined it up and put the pin in there. To put the pin in, I use needle nose pliers, but I use my brake needle nose, which are extra long ones. Makes it kind of easy. But also you got to get the cable out much further than it wants to come out. So what you do is you floor the accelerator. In this case I just reached in there and I turn the cam to the full open position, and then I wedged, in this case I just used this little plastic reservoir I had handy in there to keep it open, and that allowed the slack to stay in the cable so I could pull the cable out far enough to get this in. Otherwise you're never going to be able to get this all hooked back up. Now I'm going to put the screws back on. Now I'm going to reinstall this cover. At this point I want to remind anybody that's viewing this not to forget to reinstall your vacuum line. Then you get the assembly situated down underneath the battery tray, and then you can reinstall the electrical plug, and then you make sure you slide this little red tab back over that locks the plug on there so that it doesn't wiggle loose. Now I can reinstall the 3 bolts that bolt the assembly back into place underneath the battery tray.